Hi, Declan.
And then Tanya said in the chat, PSP, that's Tanya from.
Okay, perfect.
So right now, for those of you who just joined us, we're talking about like the concept of dehumanization and defining like what it means to be humanized, like what humanization means too. So that's kind of what we're exploring right now.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could hear from everybody in terms of what their thoughts are, on, what does it mean? And again, we don't have to worry about whether or not, it's really the answer, right?
So I was really thinking along some of the same thoughts that Calvin was about, exploring what it means to like be human, because that is like an inherent aspect of dehumanization. But I was also thinking about like how, when I say we as educators and we as US society and maybe even larger, but have a tendency to humanize things that are not human by giving them monetary value, by making them into a commodity. Sure. Things like land, space, sure. Money, time, all of these things. And in the process, because we're making all these other things part of of what we need in order to survive as humans in this context, it takes away part of our own humanity in a way.
Sure. That's really interesting what Morgan said, because as soon as you said that, I'm thinking, gosh, you know what? What a juxtaposition, right? Here we are, right? Having the state sanction killings and murders, especially Black men, right? And the state sanction defending, like what you said, Morgan, inanimate objects such as statues. Right? So that is absolutely, because again, we value certain things as being more human than others, right?
And then somehow we're trying to put a monetary value on human life at the same time, whether it is, how much we're able to produce within society with a money value attached to it, or measure productivity in various ways.
Sure.
The question that, like I said, I posed was like, what is, when we say dehumanization, like what comes to mind? And then we've kind of explored that and the humanization. So Declan or Tanya, would you, either of you, like to kind of contribute to this portion of tonight?
Well, it's lack of quality of life, lack of basic needs. That's what I think about when, for example, people that are in a poverty situation don't have their basic needs met, or not valued by society.
Declan, you got something for us, brother?
Yeah, I was just thinking, because I imagine most of us kind of have similar ideas, but I think I would maybe try and tie in something like a lot of what I heard some weird argument, or like I'm going on YouTube and I'm going into the rabbit hole of just seeing what other people are saying about anything. And I heard one person say in some YouTube video, like, would you rather have equality or freedom? And I thought that was kind of interesting. It was like, I thought it was ridiculous, because you can have both. But I thought, okay, well, what would freedom look like? I think in order for that to be true freedom, you would have to have equality or equity, whatever you want to label it as. And one thing that I thought was really good, like, it's something that I thought of, obviously, but the way it was phrased recently, I thought was good, and I thought it's worth sharing. Jon Stewart was a few weeks ago, was on all of the news and media outlets to help promote his movie that he came out with. But obviously he talked about what was going on in with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all that kind of stuff. And it led to him saying, how can you have true freedom when your healthcare is linked to you having a job? And if you don't have a job, that means you don't have healthcare. And I thought that's something I'm sure all of us have thought of before, but the way he said it just was perfect. It was like a bumper sticker, you know, like, so when I guess relating that to dehumanizing, it's seen as in our society that if you don't meet certain quotas or standards in regards to an income or a social standing, it goes back to the individual, and it's seen as like, where did you go wrong? Where did you go wrong? Instead, it should be, okay, where has society failed you? Where were you left behind? You know?
Sure.
Can I add on to that?
Of course.
I like that you mentioned the importance of the individual and how I feel like we were talking about earlier, you were talking about intersectionality, Che. And I feel like on the flip side, it's like, I feel like the process of dehumanization has a lot to do with just dividing people and like labeling people into different categories, and then creating stereotypes and suppressing, like I said, like their voice and other things as well. I didn't really have a place I was going with this, but I just thought of the idea of dehumanization having a lot to do with labeling and categorizing, and I guess dividing and conquering in a sense.
No, I think there's something there. Absolutely. Because you can't just simply dehumanize somebody without a story that follows that up, right?
Yeah.
Usually that story is done through stereotypical means, right? Right. So once you are able to then have a stereotypical marker for whatever that person is, and better yet, that group, now you're able to then, right, dehumanize all. And as we know, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, and all these people say, right, before you could actually engage in violence, one of the first things you have to do is to make somebody non-human, right? So before you could engage in violence, one of the first things you have to do is to make them, right, or dehumanize them, so that the violence that you are incurring against them actually becomes legitimate, right? So then they actually do have to really come up with really wild stories. But they've been able to do that because they control all the outlets, right? I mean, you know what? If you think about this, folks, sometimes it boggles my mind, right? Of course, when it comes to sexism and racism and all of that. But if you're actually thinking that you're going to actually have millions of people work for free for 250 years, I mean, what kind of fantastic stories would you have to make up, right? And then how are you going to actually sell that so that people believe, oh yeah, right? And then if they get out of line, then you kill them, you maim them, you rape them, you do whatever, hang them, and everybody's like, sure, why not? I mean, the kind of stories that they needed to conjure up, and then to be able to disseminate that and make that normal, right? That's pretty wild. And yet that's what they've done, right? That's what they've done. So when you are going around committing so much horrific acts of violence, the stories have to be even wilder than that, to take you away from the person who's engaging in violence to somehow defender of freedom from animals, right? So in that sense, I think dehumanization process takes multiple forms, but obviously, it's not something that happens. It's not a universal, one unilateral thing, right? You need layers after layers, which, by the way, I think Charlene was getting to this, right? When you were saying about teachers, education is one of, right, the institutions that continue to perpetuate these fantastic stories of lies, right? Even more than mass media. And mass media does their job, but education for sure, right? Because we go in thinking that this is a place where we're learning the opposite, right? It's supposed to be a place where we're all supposed to grow as human beings, right? We're supposed to all also think about different ideas and have multiple ideas, right? And so on. And that's not the case. So yes, educational institution is a very, very scary place to be.
This made me think of almost right off the bat. In the second paragraph, Freire writes, dehumanization is a distortion of what it means to
Yeah.
be fully human. And I think that's exactly the kind of, and of course, just a little bit after that, Freire then says that the oppressed themselves have become host of the oppressors. And that is by fact of having internalized the oppressor's model for humanity. Of course, Marx would call it false consciousness. And I think that's the kind of ideological control that you see from beginning to end in educational, or let's say dominant schooling. Don't want to conflate the two, as Professor Che always reiterates. And I think that to go back to some of what Professor Kravitz and Declan were talking about, I think ultimately the most obvious expression or outcome of dehumanization that you see is a denial of the subsistence or the denial of a certain group of people's vital needs. All right. Just the bare subsistence, nothing more, nothing for leisure, just what it takes to breathe, get to the next day, hopefully have a place to sleep, and even those things are denied and justified. So yeah, that's dehumanization.
I think it's fascinating the ways that, like, kind of continuing on that with from what you were saying, Calvin, is like how we do dehumanize so much in our society, right? So many of, like, groups of people, individuals, just kind of across the board, by justifying it too, not just like by justifying it, well, we're letting them do this, or well, we're letting them have a job, or oh well, the jobs are being created, if we're just kind of thinking about it that way. And it kind of goes back what you were saying, Declan, too, about the idea of, like, like access to medical resources too, and that being tied closely to our work and jobs, and really that always goes to that idea of, like, productivity, right? What we can do and how somebody can profit off of us. So really, like, the entire system is designed really from a dehumanizing perspective, right? From very much with the goal actually in mind of dehumanization, if we think about it, because if we are dehumanized so much, then we're going to prove our worth, because that's the only way for survival. And it just becomes this kind of cyclical relationship where we feel like a need, and then kind of digging in deeper, like tying it into the institution, the institutions of education that we think about, the ways that academia, for instance, pans out, right? Your value and worth as a critical educator is rooted in how many articles you can publish, right? Or your value as a teacher is rooted in how many hours you're going to spend, how much of your own money you're going to spend, or the arbitrary test scores that your students are achieving, right? And that's on like the educators level. Then you think about for the students, right? The expectations of sitting quietly and not having a voice, or even just the perspectives too of kids, and like what they're capable of, and really Calvin and I had a conversation after last class about that, like how frequently we underestimate, you know, kids. And I'm thinking about it from a K-12 perspective, right? But students as a whole too. Like we just underestimate students, which goes back to that kind of Freirean perspective of the student teacher, or student teacher, teacher student, you know, like teachers, you know, that relationship and how much the lived experience is so valuable. But of course, we wouldn't value lived experience if all we know or understand is this practice of dehumanization. Just as like a side note, like I remember one time I was writing a paper, it was about something about my experience, but they were trying to teach us how to do it in a neutral way. I had a teacher who went through and circled every use of I or my about my experience in my paper and trying to get to make me get out of not using that anymore, even though the whole point was to discuss my lived experience. So that's a very, very significant point of my schooling that I think about.
And that goes back to, I'm sorry, that goes back to what Calvin was saying, right? Erasure, right? And also linked to what Kira was saying of silencing, right? So the project is about to talk about yourself, but you can't use the word I, right? I mean, who the hell are you talking about now, right? But you know, if we link this back to Freire, one of the things that I appreciate about him throughout all of his writings, not just in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but all of his entire life, you know, you actually will hear him say this over and over again. And that what that is we have to be more realist than people who consider themselves to be realists, right? Not people who are like, well, this is reality and let's just leave it alone. What Freire is saying is most people who says this is reality really don't understand reality, right? That's why he says we got to understand what he calls objective reality. So objective reality is capitalism is an objective reality, not some fantasy that most people have about capitalism, right? So I don't know if you guys remember, they use this term quite a bit in political science, but you know, they say the way we are socialized, and they meant this as when we were kids, but I think it goes all the way through. We are socialized to believe in our institutions from what they call the tooth fairy approach, right? And that is, we are always approaching and having a relationship with our institution, let's say for political, whatever, education and so on, the way it was thought to be, not the way it really operates, right? So we continue, even when it operates in a really unequal manner, we still see our educational system as a place where great ideas and we're all considered to be equal. So they said that's a tooth fairy approach. That should work when we are 3, 4, 5 at best. It shouldn't work anymore when we're older. And yet, think about the people who defend the political institution as if, like they say, but this is the best democracy, without one iota of any kind of reality supporting that, right? So you know, so we do have to, like Freire says, it's not that we are people who are critical for the sake of being critical, right? What we should be doing is clearly articulating reality in the most brute manner that it exists, so that people are no longer operating under, oh, but our political system is supposed to be democratic. Yes, but it's not working that way. Our medical system is supposed to be the greatest. Yes, but obviously it's not operating that way. Right? And so on and so forth. Right? The legal system. And it goes back to what Morgan was saying, because this is all based under capitalism, right? Money is at the center of how much human we are, right? If you have a lot of money, then you actually can somehow try to enjoy at least what human being might be. So you could buy justice through the legal system, right? You could also buy educational system, right? You could actually buy safety depending on which neighborhoods you live in, right? I mean, depending on which neighborhood you live in, your experience of seeing a police officer is totally different, right? If you live in some certain neighborhood, you see a police officer, they're a welcome sight. Like they're your buddies. You live in another neighborhood, right? They're actually a symbol of maybe your own demise, right? So I think that's why I appreciate Freire when he says, hey, we've got to be able to understand objective reality. And by the way, he's not using the term objective in the scientific sense, like value neutral, right? He's almost using it in a sense of, look, come on, look at it. It's there. Oppression is there, right? And it's measurable, right? You know, marginalization is there and it's measurable, and so on and so forth.
I also want to note too, like one of the things that I always like to talk about, especially since, you know, just the conversation around like capitalism is so fascinating, because whenever I bring these like concepts of capitalism up in any of my classes, the immediate rebuttal, it's very difficult because we've been socialized to not question those things, like what you're saying, right? The reality of what is compared to what could be or what the intention is. And that because we're so socialized to never question that economic structure, the idea is always, there's always like a spiraling conversation of students who are like, but socialism and communism, and I'm like, wait, my anti-capitalist stance is not pro-socialism and communism either, like, right, like, but because we exist within these categories that have been created and we're socialized to believe that all there ever is or was is all there ever can be, right, is so hard to grasp beyond what could be. And I think it's always so fascinating. And it goes back to, like, you know, for those of us who have had sociology, the idea of structural functionalism, right? That if you question what is in place, then you're illogical, which we already see, right? Anybody who questions, you know, police brutality, they're already seen as illogical. People who question anything, they're seen as illogical. And I think that I really appreciate Freire's conversation, like the part on page 44, where he really talks about, it goes back to what Calvin was saying, actually, the distortion of being more fully human, but also how, like, this idea, like, for me, this socialization is a part of that oppression, right? And how we're socialized is done intentionally to maintain our oppression. And because if you were to question that oppression or invalidate the institutions that are doing that, then, you know, then that becomes a matter of humanization. On page 44, it's the last paragraph for me. It says, this then is the greatest humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well. And then, you know, continuing on, he begins talking about the idea of, like, false generosity. An unjust social order is the permanent fount of this generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. That is why the dispensers of false generosity become desperate at the slightest threat to its source. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false generosity. False generosity constrains the fearful and subdues the rejects of life to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work and working transform the world. And that's always such a vital part for me in chapter 1, because, like, so much of what we see is that false generosity, and even the conversations around, you know, around the idea of, like, anti-capitalism sometimes end up becoming a matter of false generosity as well, because it ends up just being kind of reformist and reactionary rather than an actual, like, radical transformation of what we know, which is why, going back to what I initially said, I'm always hesitant to even discuss, like, a solution to capitalism, because we haven't seen it yet, like, really truly, like, and thinking about beyond what we have known or seen so far. And I think that's such a hard idea to grasp, because we have been really, you know, we have been created and socialized under this false generosity for so long.
I just wanted to offer a quote that I think brings together so well exactly what Che and Professor Che and Charlene were saying, and that's in the first paragraph of page 51 on the third line down. It says, just as objective social reality exists not by chance, but as the product of human action, so it is not transformed by chance. If humankind produced social reality, then transforming that reality is a historical task, a task for humanity. And so if structure, if capitalism, if reality is really out of human hands and capitalism is it, then perhaps philanthropy and charity really would be true generosity. But that's not the case, because so much, and this reminds me of actually something I think Henry Giroux said. He said that dominant schooling has become a disimagination machine, right? In terms of killing creativity, killing imagination, and the ability to imagine alternatives or come up with alternatives or even conceptualize a world different from what we might have seen in our history books or what we might have been taught in school. So then, and actually I think this was something that Dr. Murphy wrote, actually, was then the idea is that we need to resurrect our imagination. We need to resurrect our imagination and realize that through imagination, it's only in human imagination that we also have the ability to create, right? To apply and to shape reality.
Can I add to that, Calvin? I think that's a fantastic point. Can you read the last, I don't have my copy with me, but can you read the last sentence again about how it is a human project, it's a historical project?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is on page 51, first paragraph, last sentence. If humankind produced social reality, then transforming that reality is a historical task, a task for humanity.
Perfect. You know what? In it, he actually is already saying that this is not something that we should look at as change that is likely to come about overnight, right? The way this reality has been created has been a historical kind of project. We also have to understand this as a historical project that we have to engage in, right, as humanity, which means all of us have to get engaged in this historical project, right? So if you look at it that way, to a certain degree, it's not as overwhelming, is it? Because it's no longer me against capitalism, but I will do my share, I'll do my part, right? In what I can, in understanding that capitalism was a creation, and I'm doing my part to make sure that creation that was based on perverseness can be not only reversed, destroyed, right, but transformed, right? But because it's a communal project, I always feel as though that I have all of you always with me, right? And that's why he always says, you can't ever do anything for somebody, because that's a sacrifice. We don't want that, right? Because when you do something for someone, even with the best intentions, guess what? You're always asking for something back. Because if you do something for someone, and you know what, you're like, and you don't even say, I don't even get a little thank you. No, that's why he says we got to always work with, right? If we're doing it with, I mean, how often do we turn to ourselves and say thank you to ourselves? That's so silly, right? So I think that him calling it it's a project of humanity is very important, because all of us has to jump into this. And there's one thing that Dr. Murphy has said. I don't know if he said it recently, but there's something that he and I did quite a while back, and that is called writing narratives together. So the idea is you never ever, even if you think it's your own story, it can never be purely yours, because your story is always produced within, juxtaposed against, right, among human beings, right? So your sadness comes because of the situation you are with others around you. It was never just alone, right? So we used to always think that we write narratives, because that's why we hear this so much, right? tell us your personal narrative. There is no such thing as a personal narrative, folks, right? There's only a narrative that we write together. However, what I tell you about my thing, what is considered personal, happens to be just more thematic, right? About my point of view, but it's never alone. It's never personal where you're all cut off, right? So I think, I mean, this is really, really amazing in a sense that everything that people have said at the very beginning, right? From Morgan to Kira to Declan to Calvin, it all fits in, doesn't it? Right? Like Kira, you were saying about grouping, categorization, right? And that's exactly what they want. They want us to be categorized into our own silos so that we actually then start screaming, why don't you hear my story, right? And Charlene's like, yeah, but my story is more painful than yours. And Kelvin's like, what are you guys talking about? So guess what ends up happening? All we're doing is just yelling and shouting, hoping that somebody would listen to my own personal story, right? Whereas this is a collective story, folks, right? It's a collective story of all of us, right? And even those who may be doing relatively better. Ultimately speaking, if we are all living in a society that is created to dehumanize people, right? Then every one of us suffers, right? So in some ways, this actually links to Black Lives Matter movement, right? So it's true, so until Black Lives Matter, not all lives can matter, right? But we all know all lives do matter, right? But all lives do not matter until the people that we have designated to go after is recognized, right? So I think in that sense, yes, I think when Kelvin read that part about that, it's a human project, it's a project of humanity, and it's a historical project. In some ways, we're in this for a long haul, folks, right? But the idea is it could change tomorrow. That's the least idea we have to have, that it could change tomorrow. It is possible, right? Maybe not probable, but it is possible. So we have to fight like hell every day as if change was going to, right, happen tomorrow. But if it doesn't, we can't be all disappointed. Like, oh man, I tried for 100 days. I can't do it anymore. No. Right? Yep. And by the way, like Charlene actually had mentioned, we're never living in an objective, neutral reality where capitalists are like, okay, hands off, you guys try your thing. No, they're constantly bombarding us, right? They're constantly dividing us. They're constantly oppressing us. They're constantly marginalizing us. So the idea is, you know what? Capitalists and racists and sexists and all of these people, these groups, are actively undermining what we're trying to do. That's the point, right? So when people say, well, have you ever seen a society that is better than capitalism? Yes, I could show you if they wouldn't stop undermining what we're trying to do, right? It's like I'm trying to show you that my roof works, but before I could start putting up the roof, they continue to pour water. And you're like, yeah, your roof doesn't work. How would you know? Right? How would you know? And I think that's very important because most of us think that we're living in a neutral state where everything is like neutral. You've tried your socialism, didn't work out. You tried your communism, Calvin, it didn't work out. You tried your fantasy world, Declan, it didn't work out, or whatever, right? Right? Where all the skateboarders could just rule the world, didn't work out, But it's never that way. These people are actively undermining us, right?
I kind of want to add something to go back to dehumanization and what it means to dehumanize. And I kind of want to share a thought I have all the time whenever like another like lynching happens in a sense, or whatever sort of act of violence happens. Like I always ask myself, like, yeah, like I feel sorry for like George Floyd, and I feel sorry for his family and stuff, and I don't want to say this to frame this the wrong way, but I'm not saying I feel sorry for the cop and like, oh, like I feel bad for them for all the bad publicity they're getting, but it's more so the question should be like, how did someone who is human get to that point to where they thought it was okay to do that in the first place, to where like I feel sorry that like we lost someone to that, you know what I mean? And I found the quote in the Freire book. It's on page 56 in the middle of the second full, and it says, whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter to this violence is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. As oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. Because it only takes a fully dehumanized person to then try and dehumanize somebody else. If somebody is humanized, then they'll recognize that what they're doing to oppress someone is not right, and they'll completely back off from it. So I can't help but recognize that someone who is taking part in the lynching is themselves dehumanized as well, and that it takes a lot of patience and a lot of courage to try and give people like that a second chance. I mean, maybe some of you saw there was well, I don't remember what city, but there's a protest where somebody who was like an all lives matter person or whatever got hurt, and there was this big black dude who carried that guy out, his enemy is, in a sense, carried him out to get him to safety because he knew he was hurt, and they can't let that happen. So not only was that extremely like courageous, but also it showed that like it was also, you know, bonus points for the Black Lives Matter movement to say like, I'm going to take care of even the person who's trying to hurt me because I want them on my side, you know. I want them to be humanized.
Yeah, you know, Declan, I think, yes, I agree. And I'm glad that you actually said that at the end, that they wanted to be humanized, right? Not like just be on my side for a tactical reason, right?
Right.
For a political kind of a ploy, right? But, you know, if you really think about it, and I do think about this often, I do, right? In terms of, gosh, you know, sometimes that's what I was telling you about this fantastic story, right? In our modern world, around the world, because we actually control all over the world, right? United States, America, we've actually made majority of the world in the image of quote unquote Americanism, right? You know, and we've done that all over the world. So what we've also sold around the world also, just like Europeans, right, was how brutish, animalistic, and nasty Black people are, right? And when you actually look at, like Paulo Freire says, objectively, how would you be able to find a group of people who are not only resilient, but accepting and loving? After being brutalized for 4 centuries, they are still majorly not saying, I want to take your children, I want your house. No, they're saying, just treat us as your equal brothers and sisters. After 400 years of brutalization, what kind of people do that? I don't know if I could do that, folks. I'm being very honest. I don't know if I could do that if somebody did that to me for 4 days, let alone for 400 years. And they are still saying, like, you know, Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop in South Africa, used to say, we are not asking to brutalize you back. All we're saying is, can you not just simply treat us as equal human beings? And it's almost like we'll let bygones be bygones. You're like, what? And yet, because we actually are the ones who perpetrated so much violence, we're the ones who actually are suffering from that psychology. You are not even dangerous But because I actually violated you, I'm always looking at you like, oh, when is that person gonna get me back? That's the psychology of us. So Declan, you know what? I am gonna actually put another thing real quick. It's gonna be another, hopefully this works. I'll put it on the chat. When you're talking about the police officer, how have they been made this way, right? How have they been made to this so desensitive,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
insensitive, right? Where you could actually stand on somebody's or whatever, neck for that long. Okay, so this actually, Adorno actually led a big study called authoritarian personality. And he actually talks about all of these things, right? He says that people who are socialized in what he calls the authoritarian personality are those who would commit the most amount of horrific act in the name of normalcy and authority, right? And think about that. I don't know how many of you actually saw, I just got a glimpse of, what's his name? Dave Chappelle's show, a recent one, right?
Stand up.
Yeah, it's a stand-up 846.
Yeah, yeah. He's sitting down, but yeah, yeah.
Sitting down. But you know what more than anything hit me during that talk was when he was talking about how scared he was when he went through the Northridge earthquake that lasted about 25 seconds. And he thought that, you know what, the whole world was crumbling. That 25-second felt like, he said, a lifetime.
Yeah.
Right. And then he transitions to, that was 25 seconds, folks. 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Yeah.
Right? 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So I actually, after I heard that, you know what? Everything else that he said throughout that whole, sit down show was a blur to me. For real. I could not get that out of my mind because I kept on thinking, what was an experience for me that I thought was so horrific that it seemed like it lasted a lifetime, right? I try to remember that. And guess what? Those experiences were nothing more than flashes that lasted 3 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds. And yet you're thinking, God, that was so traumatic that I might still be working that out, right? How do you work out 400 years of being unable to breathe? How do you work that out? Have we offered collective therapy, not only to African Americans, but the indigenous or Native Americans, women, the poor? I mean, my gosh, I go through something personal, and you know what? All my family members, friends are saying, go see a therapist, they'll help you out. I'm sure they can, right? I mean, but compare, it's like a hangnail, right? And yet, how do we expect these groups of people to actually ever begin the healing process when the space is never given, right? It's not only not given, they're continuing to have assault. And this is why, when I don't know why, but when I heard that, folks, for me, that just resonated so much with me. 25 seconds of an earthquake that seemed like the earth was falling apart. Imagine 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And then it took me to imagine 400 years, right? So I don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, folks. But I do know, like Charlene was saying, that what we need to do is also announce, not only denounce, like Freire says, but announce. I think one of the things that we could announce is, hey, you know what? It may be a small thing, but let's start with some therapy here. But do you know what I mean by that? Not only at the practical level, but when you talk about therapy, you know what that means? That means that we are in the process of having to accept that those traumas actually happened. Because our society, the United States right now, we're not even ready to admit, right? We're not even ready to admit the 250 years of slavery, right? 90 years. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm saying, and we're not even willing to like admit that, but then the next step is even willing to admit which practices have been harmful, right? Assimilation is a very violent act,
Absolutely.
but right, and people will say, well, you know, people have chosen to do that themselves, but out of necessity, out of literal survival, right?
Yeah.
That's a very violent act too. And that takes place of generations, right? That's why we see the loss of language and culture and values and families.
Sure.
And
sure.
so, you know, it's like, it's very easy for us to go ahead and say, well, yeah, you know, those acts of physical violence or atrocities, hypothetically it's easy, but like, right, it should be easy to say that, but we're not even willing to admit that, like you said. But then what about the other layers, right? The institutions that are still using standardized testing with historical roots of, you know, of eugenic science, right? And well, I say science, you know, and like, and all of these. So it's fascinating to think about, and heartbreaking and heart-wrenching, right? That we can't even discuss the actual physical violence that we've done against people as a country and as societies, but then add on the other layers of the mental and emotional and psychological anguish, right? That carries throughout generations.
Sure.
That adds a whole other layer to it too.
Of course. And you know, you're going to get that when we talk like this, you're going to get so many people who actually have a knee-jerk reaction of, well, then what? We're going to have to now address, you know, women saying that they've been oppressed. We're going to have to address this. Yes. You know, that doesn't say anything other than when they say, yeah, but then this group and that group and that group. You know what that shows us? Rather than throwing our hands up saying, well, we can't then just, you know, give a redress to everybody. No. That shows you how violent our society has been, like Charlene says. We didn't violate only one group, right? We violated multitude of groups throughout our history.
Right? It also shows you that they know.
Yes, absolutely they know. Because if they didn't know, they wouldn't be so forthright in making sure that people don't lift that thing up to see, right?
Which then goes back to, I think, what Declan or Calvin were saying about the idea in Freire, right, where he talks about how the necessity of even having this conversation implies that it's taken place, right? The necessity of talking about what humanization looks like means that dehumanization has taken place, right? Sure. And you know, he also, like Freire also talks about how the very fact of resistance, the very fact of like pushback, you know, from the dominant group against like the oppressors is in itself an indicator that, you know, that they know. And so that goes very much like you were saying, Declan, that it means they know.
Sure. Mm-hmm. You know, it's already 8, but can we actually have at least Morgan, everyone actually, except for me, everyone kind of maybe have like, you know, your thoughts of the day or thoughts after the lecture or any thoughts that you are having right now?
Or even questions too, like as if some of the things that we've, yeah.
Sure.
Well, now that we've been going through all this stuff with the economy and the pandemic, I hope that we as a society here in the United States can do capitalism right. That's what I've thought about all these days. Or that the economic structures in this country can start to change.
Yes. Morgan?
I have lots of thoughts.
Sure, let it rip.
I'm actually going to send my notes over to Shirley. I've been like doodling and writing this whole time. But I think that as we talk about like our realities and where we want to go as we imagine different structures, imagine different societies, we really need to like be explicit in how we talk about the history of how we got here. So, you know, by naming rich white men created the capitalistic structures that really determine what humanity looks like and how humans are valued in our society. I mean, that ties back to like school funding and how that plays with assimilation that takes place in our schools. Sure. Not even to go into like, you know, standardized testing and stuff like that, but really looking at digging at the foundation of how we arrived to where we are today in order to be able to break these systems and rebuild something that's better, something that's more equal and just and joyful.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Gotta have some joy in our lives, right?
I just want to share something real quick, but and then I had a different thing I liked on the actually I think the last page of the first chapter, but yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Morgan, because I just had an experience recently working at this outdoor education camp where a boy was just like, I don't know, I was kind of far away, but I heard him say like, Sasha can't go over the log because like, of course she's scared, she's a girl. And then me and my partner were like, uh-oh. And so we like ran over there. And I wasn't sure what to do because they're like 3rd and 4th graders, right? So they're like young. And I was kind of like, okay. And he said something like, let's make sure we're using respectful language with one another. And in my gut feeling was like, that's just not direct enough. Like, that's just not like, and I didn't even know if that was the right thing to do. Like, I seriously just was like, I'm like, fuck it, I'm just gonna go for it and like see. So I just was like, I think, you know, boys and girls, anyone can go over this log, go over, do anything. Like if they've said them, like I don't know, I don't actually remember exactly what I said, but I said something more direct because it's like language is so important and so powerful. And it was a learning moment for me because I then talked to my other coworkers, and one of them was like, yeah, like let's start this at kindergarten, like let's start talking about this stuff when they are young, because like why not, like let's normalize talking about these things because we need to.
Yes.
Small tangent, but another thing I really liked was on the last page I circled the terms permanent recreators. I thought that was kind of like a paradox in a way because it's like permanent and then the prefix of re is like
Yes.
circular. I don't know. We can also, like, anyone can talk about what they think about it, but I just really liked it because it's kind of like what you were saying, Che, and it kind of relates to burnout because I've definitely had that, like,
You froze.
not sorry.
You froze for a second.
Yeah, I was wondering if I did. You all froze on my screen. But I don't remember what was the last thing I said. But just how it needs to be permanent, and it can't be like after you said 100 days, like, okay, I'm done. It's like it's a permanent praxis that we are recreating every day.
Perfect.
So I liked that it ended on that because it made me feel like hopeful and
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
I'll go next. So, you know, like echoing Morgan, I have lots of thoughts too. I always do, and I'm trying to kind of like contextualize it in terms of like the socio-political. I think there's a couple things too that I'm noticing like that we've addressed kind of as a group, and then like within the reading too is one of the things that Dr. Che always talks about that we really kind of hold true as an organization too is the idea of like the socio-political and the philosophical. And that's a reoccurring thing, and I think that it's like what you were talking about, Kira and Dr. Che too, about how like these categorizations have been created in many ways, right, to allow us, like, force us to disengage, to force us to like really as a way to like prevent solidarity, right, in these systems that have intentionally harmed people. However, you know, and it's like you were saying, like it's not like we don't know that theoretically, philosophically, all lives matter, right? Yeah, of course we know that, but sociopolitically, that has not been the case, right? So a lot of the things that we're talking about, of course, like in the big picture, we would love to be able to say all of these things. And in the big picture, we'd love to be able to say, we're all human, right? Like there's always that argument of like, oh, I, you know, why do we talk about race? We're all human. Yeah, yeah, no crap, like I'm aware of this, right? But within the socio-political, that's not the reality, right? There's a difference between what is like, and it goes back to what you're saying too, Dr. Shea, about like how it's intended versus how it's played out. And I think that's really important for us to highlight throughout even reading this, is that it's like, yeah, of course we'd love to be able to say, you know, all the different layers and all the groups of people to just come together and be happy. And yeah, but that's not the way it works. And I think that's why this piece is so important, is to really start thinking about that. And going to what you were saying, Morgan, too, is like naming those things, like naming all the groups and all the different layers that have created these institutions is so important, to be able to kind of break apart without essentializing it, without creating a hierarchy, right, of needs and like oppression, right, hand in hand, but recognizing that they are all a part of a larger structure that was intentionally designed to oppress people at different intersections, right? And so kind of like wrapping up, my hope was that for tonight we would kind of talk about like this idea, and then now what, which we'll venture into, I'm sure, the next week. But on page 54, I really liked, it's the last two paragraphs. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he talks about, if the implementation of a liberating education requires political power and the oppressed have none, how then is it possible to carry out the pedagogy of the oppressed prior to the revolution? He talks about how it's going to go into chapter 4, but he does say one aspect of the reply is to be found in the distinction between systematic education, which can only be changed by political power, and educational projects, which should be carried out with the oppressed in the process of organizing them. And then he goes into the pedagogy of the oppressed as a humanist and libertarian. Pedagogy has two distinct stages. In the first, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression, and through the practice commit themselves to its transformation. In the second stage, in which the reality of oppression has already been transformed, this pedagogy ceases to belong to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. And it goes back to what you were saying, Kira, too. Like, I like how he says the process of permanent liberation, rather than it being the end goal or outcome of permanent liberation, right? Because it's always a process. So I really like that, because he does recognize that, right? Like the systematics is the larger systems at hand, and how difficult it is to change those things, and existing within, right? So kind of going back to like, as teachers, right? We recognize that these systems are like structurally inherent, like there's like that structural inherency, right, of it being problematic. It was not designed for all and intentional in its oppression. So how can we as teachers, within what we have power to do, and that is one way, is carrying out projects. And we're not talking about, you know, like your project-based learning, which I have feelings on, but the idea of like real genuine projects collaboratively with the oppressed, which is why I actually really value the name of our organization, because it's the Dignified Learning Project, right? We're not talking a small thing. And I actually had, just as a real quick side note, I had gotten somebody who messaged me one time really angry at me, or us as an organization, because we used the project because they said it sounded like it was too temporary, and that we weren't really dedicated to changing education, and that we should change the name of our organization. And this right here really shows how much it's so much more than just like the idea of project that we know it to be. So I think what I kind of would like to say, and I'd like to hear Calvin's thoughts too, but I want us to kind of maybe start thinking about like, what are some of those projects that we can do? And then also maybe ways that on a systematic way we could change it. And even to kind of bring those things to light, maybe as a merger of the two, how can we use those educational projects to really start challenging the systematic levels of things too? And then, yeah, Calvin, I'm done talking.
Absolutely. I think that everything begins at, well, it begins with the people we know, right, at the community level. But obviously the recognition eventually is that what we consider to be community problems or community anxieties are, in fact, not simply local problems. They are local problems that are reflected universally, globally now, because capitalism has become such a huge system, a global system that's been imposed, indeed. So I'm really glad you pointed out these two sections on page 54, because these gave me ideas. And I think the idea is that at the most basic level, we do have to begin initiating pedagogy of the oppressed, right? At the community-based level, that will lead to a realization of the vocation for humanization, the kind of inherent permanence of human praxis. Because what happens the day after the revolution, we don't stop. We got to keep humanizing, right? That's what makes us the permanent recreators, the permanent co-creators. And I think that I've had some students ask me before for almost like a more substantial blueprint. But I think what I've always told them is, I can't do this without you. I can't do this without you because I don't know right now. I don't know right now. And there's too many people who don't know, as Professor Che was saying earlier, kind of still unaware of the dehumanization that has become so normalized. I don't know right now. I wish I did, but I need you. I need you. And that's why we educate. That's why we love, and that's why we hope. Because we are the permanent recreators, not I am the recreator, or I am the blueprint maker or engineer, and you all are the constructors, right? That's kind of the problem that I think utopianism has fallen into at times historically. But that we need to humanizing all, educating all, and a collective recognition of structure and of, in fact, what has become global structure. So that's all I have in the meantime.
That was beautiful.
So thank you, everybody. Unless anybody else or Dr. Shea, you haven't had a chance to wrap
No,
up.
no,
Did you
no.
want to say
I
anything?
said except for me. I wanted to hear everybody else.
Thank you.
So I'm really, I know we went over the mark, but I'm really happy with how today went, and I really appreciate everybody showing up here. We'll have another Wednesday at 7, and yeah. I will talk to
It's
you
a
all next
real
week.
class. I feel like this is like a real class that we're all learning from each other.
Absolutely.
I was gonna say real quick, thank you, Charlene, and also everyone for inviting me into your space and sharing.
Of course.
It's really great.
Thank you.
Friends, thank you for showing up.
Yeah, thank you.
Stay, let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene.
Until next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.